very good evening, all of you. Uh, am I audible? And is my screen visible? Please confirm if I'm audible and if my screen is visible. Uh, yeah, thank you so much, Abhishek, Ojas, Shubham, Pulkishan for confirming. Okay. So here we are again with this pediatric last resort revision for your upcoming FMG exams, right? So we'll be covering some very important topics which are must know for your FMG exam. But it is a revision session, so I want a both way communication. I want each and every one of you to answer every question that we discuss, okay? And along with each question we discuss, we will be covering lots of other related topics as well, okay? So let us begin straight away for this rapid revision marathon session, right? So let us start with some basic questions from general pediatrics. So calculate the mid parental height, okay? You have to calculate the mid parental height for a male child, okay, whose father is 180 centimeters tall and mother is 157 centimeters tall. So any child with short stature, okay, we calculate the mid parental height to get an idea whether it is familial short stature or some other underlying cause for short stature. Now what is the formula for mid parental height? So don't worry, PDF of the session will be available for all of you. So please focus on the discussion and on answering the questions. So you will get a PDF of the session after it. Okay. So mid parental height is a very important concept in short stature. So for boys, if you have to calculate it, for boys the formula is father's height plus mother's height plus 13 by 2, where the father's height and mother's height is in centimeters, right? And for the girls, the formula, what is the formula for girls? So for girls, the formula is father's height plus mother's height minus 13 by 2 centimeters. Okay, so since what has been given in this question is a male child, okay, male child. So we will use the formula for boys. So what will be the mid-parental height in this case? The father's height is mentioned as 180, mother's height is mentioned as 157, and you will also add 13 because it is a boy, divided by 2. So what will you get? So you will get 180 plus 170 divided by 2. So that is 175 centimeters. So I can see so many of you have answered correctly. Very nice. Aditya, Harsh, Raksha, Ojas, Aditi, right? Mohanlal, so very good, right? So all of you should make an attempt to answer each and every question, because in your FMG exam there is no negative marking. So please, each and every one of you get into that habit of answering every question, okay? So your concept should be clear, okay? Then you'll be able to answer very, very easily. And we have to read the question very carefully before answering. And in other questions where you do not know the answer straightforward, try to eliminate the options, okay? We'll be coming to some of those questions also. So this was a pretty straightforward question, and the answer to this is 175 centimeters, right? Okay. So which is the first tooth to appear in a child? Now, since nothing is mentioned whether temporary tooth or permanent tooth, so we will assume it to be temporary or milk teeth, because that is the, first which tooth comes. So it is the milk teeth that comes first, right? So wow. So I can see almost all of you have answered correctly. Very, very good. Yes. So of course, the first temporary tooth or milk tooth to, erupt in a child is the lower central incisor. So with this question, we can quickly revise some of the basic facts about dentition. So primary dentition, we all know, refers to the milk teeth, okay? The secondary dentition refers to the permanent teeth. So each of what we are discussing here is an important one-liner or can come into a false type of questions, right? So primary dentition, the milk teeth begins to appear at 6 to 7 months of life, while the secondary dentition begins around 6 years of age, okay? The first milk tooth to erupt in a child, or the first tooth to erupt in a child, what is it? So we already mentioned it is the lower central incisor, yeah. So you can also call it mandibular incisor or lower central incisor. In secondary dentition, what is the first tooth to erupt? Yes, anyone? Secondary dentition, the first tooth to erupt is the first molar, right? Which is the last tooth to erupt in primary dentition. So it is the second molar. While the last tooth to erupt in secondary dentition or permanent teeth, it is the third molar. So you can see the molars are everywhere. First molar is the first permanent tooth, second molar is the last milk tooth, and third molar is the last permanent teeth. It is also called the wisdom teeth, right? So completes by primary dentition. When does it complete? So it usually completes by 2.5 to 3 years. Secondary dentition completes at 12 years, except of course the third molars. The third molar or wisdom teeth usually erupts between 18 to 25 years of age and may not erupt in some of us also, right? And the total number of teeth in primary dentition, how much is it? So it is 20, while in permanent dentition it is 28 to 32 depending on how many third molars have erupted. And the period of mixed dentition, if someone asks you, the period of mixed dentition is what age group? So mixed dentition is between 6 to 12 years of age, where there will be some temporary tooth and some permanent tooth inside the oral cavity of the child, right? And even though the first tooth usually erupts at the age of 6 to 7 months, when do you call it delayed dentition? So we call it delayed dentition only when no tooth erupts by, yes, can someone tell me? Very good, Mohammed Farman, Ojas, Prashant, Prem Singh, Tawfiq, Himanshu, Aman, Anjum. Yes, I want answers from more of you, yeah. So delayed dentition when no tooth erupts by 13 months age. How can you remember? So 6 to 7 months age, primary dentition usually begins. But if no tooth by 6 plus 7, that means 13 months, then it is delayed dentition, right? Okay. And some important causes of delayed dentition we all know, like rickets, hypopituitarism, hypothyroidism, Down syndrome, cleidocranial dysostenosis, and so on. So moving ahead, what is the likely age? Okay, what is the likely age of a child who can ride a tricycle, copy a circle and rectangle, but cannot copy a triangle, right? So you have to know, the time of these some of these basic milestones, and then we'll be able to answer this question. Yeah. So here comes the importance of reading the entire question very, very carefully. Don't just see copy rides a tricycle and mark it as 3 years. No. Okay. Because some other milestones also mentioned. Like what? Like copies a circle and rectangle also. The child is able to copy a circle and rectangle also, but cannot copy a triangle. So let us first, do a quick recap of some of the very important developmental milestones, and we come back to answer this question. Meanwhile, I want each and every one of you to answer it correctly. Give it a thought once again. What should be the best answer? Okay. Some important gross motor milestones, again a rapid fire. So neck control. Partial neck control, if you ask me, comes by 3 months of age. Complete neck control by 5 months. Sitting with support. So everything will come with support first, without support later. So sitting with support will come at 6 months. Without support will come around 8 months. Again, standing with support will come by 9 months. Standing without support will come by around 12 months. Okay. Creeping will come in between around 10 to 11 months of age. And here some other milestones will also come, like cruising and pivoting. Okay. Okay, right. Walking with support again comes at around 12 months of age only, 12 months. But walking without support comes around 13 months of age. Rides a tricycle, of course, we all know, very, very important. It is 3 years of age. But in the question given to us, it was not just rides a tricycle. Rides a tricycle means 3 years of age to definitely child's ages. Now we have to see what other milestones are also given. Okay, so let's move ahead. So important 5 motor milestones. Hand regard, when does it come? So 3 months. Reaches out for objects, okay, but not able to catch it, will come around 4 months of age. Bidextrous grasp, holds with both hands. So bidextrous grasp will come at what age? 5 months. Palmar grasp, okay, palmar grasp will come at 6 months. Once the child has held the object with one hand, now the child can transfer objects from one hand to another. So it will be 7 months. Now then, holding of small objects. First immature pincer grasp and then mature pincer grasp like this, using just the thumb and the index finger. Okay, right. So immature pincer grasp will come at 9 months. Mature pincer grasp around 12 months. Scribble spontaneously. So if you give your notebook and a pen to the child, this is what is going to happen around 15 months of age. Tower of 6 to 7 cubes at 2 years of age. Number of cubes put in our tower is 8 into 3. So 2 years 6 cubes, 3 years tower of 9 cubes. Okay. Handedness. When does handedness appear? So handedness appears. At around 2 years of age or 24 months. But handedness gets established by 3 years of age. Okay. Right. Now moving ahead to the drawing skills of a child. Very, very important. And the turning point in the question given here. So when is a child able to copy a straight line? A line has got how many ends? 2 ends. Copies a straight line at 2 years. Similarly, a rectangle has got how many vertices? 4 vertices. So copies a rectangle at 4 years. So in the given question, the child was able to copy a rectangle. So his age is definitely 4 years. Okay. Now copies a circle. Copies a circle comes at 3 years. Circle is all round and 3 has got this round. So copies a circle at 3 years. Okay. Copies a triangle at 5 years. In this given question, the child was not able to copy a triangle. That means his age was less than 5 years. Okay. Now copies a diamond. So a diamond like this that you can see. So copies a diamond at 6 years. Right. Now some important social milestones. Social smile comes at around 2 months. Some books say 3 months also. Around 2 months, 2 to 3 months. Mirror play 6 months. Stranger anxiety. The child gets anxious on looking at strangers at 7 months. Waves bye bye, again a very important favorite milestone in the MCQs. It comes at 9 months. Plays peekaboo. So peekaboo, when does a child play peekaboo? Around 10 months of age. Plays a simple ball game at 12 months. Points to objects 15 months. Domestic mimicry, that means imitate simple household tasks that the parent does at 18 months. Dry during daytime also at 18 months. Dry at night by 3 years. But when do you call it nocturnal enuresis? So we call it nocturnal enuresis when a child continues to pass urine in bed at night involuntarily beyond 5 years of age. Okay, the cutoff is 5 years in the definition, right? Parallel play comes at what age? 2 years, and they join and play at 3 years. Now the language milestones, the important ones, the child vocalizes at 2 months. A more musical sound, that is cooing, at 3 months. Monosyllabic babbling at 6 months. Bisyllabic babbling like papa, mama, papa, but without meaning at 9 months. 2 to 3 words with meaning at 1 year. Okay, 1 year, 2 to 3 words with meaning. Jargon speech at 15 months. A child knows 10 words with meaning at around 18 months of age, and the child is able to speak sentences, 2-word sentences at 2 years of age, 3-word sentences at 3 years of age, 4-word sentences at 4 years of age, and so on. So these are some very, very important milestones that we must know, right? So moving back to the question, yes, Anju, what's your question? So moving back to our question, see, the child is able to ride a tricycle. That means his developmental age is definitely 3 years. Copies a circle, again at 3 years, but copies a rectangle at 4 years. Cannot copy a triangle, that means it is less than 5 years. So the child's developmental age here would be C, that is 4 years, right? Okay. So this is what usually happens. But some of the kids can, achieve the milestones at an earlier age also. Some can achieve at a later age also. But when you answer, you keep what is the usual scenario in mind while answering. Okay. All right. So moving ahead. Absolute contraindication to breastfeeding. Is it galactosemia in the infant, maternal HIV infection, maternal CMV infection, and herpes not involving the breast? So let us first discuss some contraindications to breastfeeding. We come back to answer this question. So contraindications can be related to the baby. Like, if the baby is a confirmed case of galactosemia, then the breastfeeding is definitely contraindicated. It is sort of an absolute contraindication, right? And galactosemia, how will the baby present? So baby will present with jaundice, vomiting, bilateral oil drop cataracts. So galactosemia has come in a question previously. So bilateral oil drop cataract. And what are the enzymes deficient? The enzymes deficient are like galactose 1-phosphate transferase, okay, epimerase, and galactokinase, right? So galactosemia, or if the baby is a confirmed case of primary lactose intolerance, okay. In these situations, we are going to avoid breastfeeding definitely, because the baby will not be able to digest lactose which is present in the milk and galactose which is present in the milk. Now, some contraindications can be related to the mother. Again, some absolute contraindications, some relative contraindications. Absolute contraindication related to mother being if the mother is on chemotherapy or radiotherapy, okay, chemotherapy or radiotherapy due to some malignancy, right? And relative contraindications include some infections in the mother, where you may or may not breastfeed depending on the exact situation, like maternal HIV. So in developed countries, they say not to breastfeed. And in India also, where it is a resource limited setting, if the child comes from a well-to-do family who can afford a safe and reliable alternate feeding, you can avoid breastfeeding. But most of the resource limited settings, most of the individuals here who belong to the lower socioeconomic strata may not be able to give a proper replacement feeding which is safe, feasible, affordable, and all. So in that situation, doing breastfeeding is much better than not doing it, right? Okay. So maternal HIV, what else? So maternal HIV, similarly some other infections like maternal varicella, okay, maternal varicella or chickenpox, where if the lesions are specifically involving the nipple and areola area, okay. Similarly, some other infections like maternal TB, which is untreated, okay, sputum positive pulmonary TB, and treatment has not been started, or treatment has been started given less than 3 weeks, right? So, or maternal breast cancer. So these are relative contraindications where you may or may not breastfeed depending on the exact situation, right? Now, so absolute contraindication to breastfeeding, definitely galactosemia in infant is one of the absolute contraindications. Maternal HIV is a relative contraindication. Maternal CMV, usually breastfeeding is not contraindicated. Herpes not involving the breast, again breastfeeding is not contraindicated, right? So the best answer is A. Moving ahead, nutrient deficient in breast milk. Vitamin A, B, C, K. I want each and every one of you to answer this correctly. Come on, waiting for your reply. Meanwhile, we discuss the content or composition of breast milk versus cow milk briefly. So lactose content is more in breast milk or cow milk? So it is more in breast milk. So breast milk has a lactose content of 7 gram per dl as compared to, how much? So as compared to around 4.5 gram per dl in cow's milk. So breast milk has higher lactose content as compared to cow's milk. What about protein? Breast milk has lesser protein as compared to cow's milk. So breast milk has 1 gram per dl versus 3 to 3.5 gram per dl in cow's milk. And breast milk contains adequate amounts of amino acids like cysteine, taurine, methionine, which are required for CNS development of the baby. And breast milk is richer in whey proteins, which are more easily digestible, like lactalbumin, while cow's milk is rich in casein, which is not so easily digestible, right? Okay, lipids. What about lipids? So lipids, the breast milk is rich in PUFA. What is PUFA? Polyunsaturated fatty acids, and it is also rich in DHA. What is DHA? DHA is docosahexaenoic acid, which is required for the CNS development of baby. Docosahexaenoic acid required for the CNS development of the baby, right? Which is lesser in cow's milk. What about minerals? So the calcium phosphate ratio in breast milk is such that it favors calcium absorption. While what about cow's milk? Cow's milk is richer in phosphate. So if a baby is predominantly cow milk fed, what is going to happen? There's going to be hypocalcemia in a baby who is predominantly cow milk fed. Both breast milk and cow's milk are poor sources of iron, but the iron present in breast milk is more easily absorbable. So BM here is not bone marrow, it is breast milk when you read the PDF later. So iron present in breast milk is more easily absorbable as compared to cow's milk, right? So vitamins, what about vitamins? So vitamins, the breast milk contains, so this is a very, very, very important fact that we must know. Breast milk contains adequate amounts of all vitamins except, yes, very good Ojas. Raj, Kiran, one of the answers is right, another is wrong. So except vitamin D, vitamin K, and vitamin B12 in strictly vegan mothers who don't even take cow's milk. So because breast milk is deficient in vitamin D, what is recommended? First year of life, all the babies should get 400 international units of vitamin D supplementation daily. Because breast milk is deficient in vitamin K, all babies should receive 1 milligram intramuscular vitamin K at birth to prevent. Now this was also asked previously, to prevent what? So to prevent hemorrhagic disease of newborn. The new name for hemorrhagic disease of newborn is vitamin K deficiency bleeding. Okay, hemorrhagic disease of newborn. Right? Now cow's milk, it is deficient in vitamin C. If a baby is predominantly cow milk fed, then more chances of scurvy in that baby. Okay, right? Now coming back to our question. So nutrient deficient in breast milk is, so here not ABC, our answer would be vitamin K. Okay, because we're talking about breast milk. Right. Moving ahead, features of angular cheilitis. So nowadays a lot of questions come from micronutrients also, so please brush that up once again. So features of angular cheilitis, stomatitis, and glossitis are seen in which vitamin deficiency? So it's not niacin, it is. Okay, I'll come back to the question. First, let all of you answer. Right. So vitamin A deficiency. So vitamin A deficiency, what is the first symptom? of vitamin A deficiency? So it is night blindness. Okay, night blindness. And what is the first sign of vitamin A deficiency? It is conjunctival cirrhosis or drying. And of course, in your ophtha also, you would have studied the WHO, staging of vitamin A deficiency. So we know, a lot of things happen like conjunctival cirrhosis. Then, there are bite spots, corneal cirrhosis, corneal ulceration, finally scarring, right? Riboflavin. So riboflavin or vitamin B2 deficiency leads to this angular cheilitis, stomatitis, oral ulcers. Okay, glossitis can also be there. Nasolabial dysplasia can be there, right? Even some conjunctival, vascularity may be affected. Niacin deficiency leads to what? So niacin deficiency leads to pellagra, right? Pellagra. Pellagra is a disease of 4 Ds. So what happens? So there is diarrhea, dementia, dermatitis, and even death can happen. And what is the typical rash? It is there in the photosensitive areas, and we call it Casals necklace. Okay, photosensitive areas, you have the rash, Casals necklace. Pyridoxine deficiency can cause neurological features like peripheral neuropathy. In children, it is a very important cause of refractory neonatal or infantile seizures, which are not getting controlled by any antiepileptic. So refractory neonatal or infantile seizures, right? Cobalamin, again, 2 things it can cause. So it can cause hematological manifestations, that is megaloblastic anemia, and neurological manifestation, that is what? Subacute combined degeneration. So subacute combined degeneration of spinal cord. Okay, degeneration of spinal cord. Now what about biotin? So biotin deficiency can cause, neurological features. Neurological features. So neurological features like, there can be seizures, developmental delay, plus, skin and hair manifestations. Very good. So it's Abhay and Abhishek, Purushottam, Muhammad. Very good. So there are skin and hair manifestations. So skin rash and alopecia. Zinc deficiency. Now zinc deficiency can give rise to what all? Zinc deficiency can cause diarrhea. It can cause rashes, usually around orifices. And, on fingers and all. So an inborn error of metabolism where, there's a problem with zinc transport or absorption is acrodermatitis enteropathica. And in addition, there can be other features like, hypogonadism, growth failure, and so on. Delayed wound healing, poor wound healing, okay? Right? Poor wound healing. Acrodermatitis enteropathica. Vitamin C deficiency, what does it cause? So vitamin C deficiency leads to scurvy. What happens in scurvy? So the collagen does not form properly because, formation of collagen requires vitamin C. If collagen is not formed properly, collagen is the backbone of blood vessels. So blood vessels are fragile. So what all you can have? You can have gum bleeding. You can have painful subperiosteal hemorrhage involving the long bones. Subperiosteal hemorrhage of long bones. And because of that, what happens? Painful pseudoparalysis. Painful pseudoparalysis of limbs. That means the child will not want to move the limbs because of the pain. Okay, right? And what else? Vitamin C is required for iron absorption. So if vitamin C is not there, iron absorption does not take place properly. So you can get iron deficiency anemia as well. And the child will be irritable. Okay, right? So coming back to our question, features of angular cheilitis, stomatitis, glossitis, which vitamin deficiency? It's not niacin, it is riboflavin. Cobalamin would cause megaloblastic anemia. Folate deficiency would also cause megaloblastic anemia. Vitamin C deficiency would cause scurvy. So coming to our next question. So a child presents with, what does the child present with? Let us see. So presents to the OPD with fatigue, okay, bone pains and swollen and bleeding gums. Physical examination reveals petechiae on her skin and tender swelling of the thigh. Which of the following can be given to treat her condition? So the child is having fatigue, which can be due to anemia. Bone pains are there and swollen and bleeding gums. So gum bleeding, bone pain, and swelling of the thigh could be due to this painful subperiosteal hemorrhage involving the long bones. Okay, so this is a case scenario where we are going to suspect scurvy, especially if predominantly cow milk fed baby is there. So of course, scurvy is vitamin C deficiency. So what will you give for treatment? We'll give vitamin C, not A, D, E, right? Okay. Now this is the typical X-ray finding that you get in scurvy. We'll not be going into detail, but you get this ring-shaped epiphysis, that is Wimberger sign, and you get a lot of other signs as well, like pencil thin outline of the cortex, Pelton spurs, okay, white line of Frenkel, and so on. Okay. And what do you get in this X-ray? Yes, what is your diagnosis here? Again, this is a spotter. So what you can see? What can you see? So what we can see is cupping, fraying, and splaying of the ends of long bones. Cupping means concavity, fraying means irregularity, and splaying means widening. So cupping, fraying, and splaying of the ends of long bones. And what is your diagnosis then if this is the X-ray? Yes, what is your diagnosis if this is the X-ray? Very, very important spotter. Of course, it's rickets. Most common cause of rickets in children would be nutritional vitamin D deficiency. Now, pearly white lesions. So you have pearly white lesions with foamy appearance are seen on the sclera of a 3-year-old girl. You can see what is the lesion here. So these are Bitot spots, triangular lesions on the sclera that you can see. Pearly white. Okay. So these are Bitot spots in a girl, 3-year-old girl weighing 13 kgs. How much vitamin A should be given as treatment? So vitamin A dose is also very important. So I can see most of you answering correctly again. So for the treatment of vitamin A deficiency, if the child is less than 6 months old, the dose will be 50,000 international units per dose. 6 to 12 months would be 1 lakh international units. More than 1 year, and the weight should be more than 8 kgs. Then each dose is 2 lakh international units. Okay. And how many doses are required? 3 doses are required for treatment of vitamin A deficiency. At 0, that means at diagnosis, 24 hours later, and 2 to 4 weeks later. Some books say 2 weeks later, some books say the third dose you can give 4 weeks later, right? So the best answer here, because the age is 3 years and the weight is more than 8 kg, so each dose is going to be how much? 2 lakh international units. And total dose, how many doses you'll give? 3 doses, right? Okay. Now moving ahead, a child's height for age. So height for age is at minus 2.8 Z score of expected. That means the height for age is how much? Less than minus 2 Z score, right? So this child will be classified under which category? Wasting, normal, stunting, SAM. So before I answer this question, Rohan, read the question once again. And I can see many of you answering correctly. So WHO classification of malnutrition, we'll quickly go through, then we come back to answer this question. So 3 things are seen in WHO classification of malnutrition. One is weight for height, another is height for age, and the third thing that you see is whether edema is present or not. Right, now based on weight for height, if the weight for height is between minus 2 to minus 3 Z score or between 70 to 79% of expected, it is called wasting. So remember, it is weight for height and not weight for age, okay? Very, very important. If it is less than minus 3 Z score, less than 70% of expected, again it is wasting, but it is severe wasting. Height for age between minus 2 to minus 3 Z score, between 85 to 89% of expected is stunting. So our child in the question falls in this category. The height for age is between minus 2 to minus 3 Z score, right? Height for age here is how much? Minus 2.8. That means between minus 2 to minus 3 Z score. So this child has stunting, okay? Stunting. And if the height for age is less than minus 3 Z score or less than 85% of expected, then also it is stunting, but it is severe stunting, okay? Right? Now, if edema is present, you call it edematous malnutrition, edematous wasting or edematous stunting and so on. So that is the WHO classification of malnutrition that gives us very important terminologies. Now, coming to severe malnutrition, or better put as severe acute malnutrition if we call it, severe acute malnutrition or SAM. The mid-arm circumference will be less than how much? Waiting for your replies. So I can see Pramila, Leena, Shushti, Ajay, Anshul Patel, Ayush, Pavan, Megha, Siddharth, Abhishek, Upmanyu. So many of you are answering correctly. Everyone should answer. So first we'll see the definition of SAM, then we come back to answer this question. So SAM is defined in a child 6 months to 5 years age by presence of one or more of, okay? One or more of what all? So one is weight for height. So remember, it's not weight for age, it's weight for height less than 70% of expected or less than minus 3 Z score. That means what? Severe wasting. Remember your WHO classification, right? Mid-arm circumference or mid-upper arm circumference less than 11.5 centimeters, and presence of symmetric bipedal edema of nutritional origin. Symmetric bipedal edema of nutritional origin, right? If any of these is present, then we call it severe acute malnutrition or SAM, right? Coming back to our question then. So SAM, the mid-arm circumference will be less than 11.5 centimeters, right? What is this? Yes, anyone? What is this and what is it used to measure? Yes? So weight for age, we don't use to call it, wasting and all. Weight for age will just tell you if the weight for age is less than minus 2 Z score, we can say that the child has undernutrition, okay? So if you do not have growth charts for weight for height, you will use weight for age, but otherwise weight for height is a better, parameter to use. Yes, very good. So Sanjay, Harsh, Rahul, so many of you also have answered. I missed those names, Kamadia, Akash, Shubham. So it is a Shakir's tape. Shakir's tape, which is used to measure mid-arm circumference by the health workers. So you can see here is a red zone and a yellow zone and a green zone. So if the mid-arm circumference, because the cutoff values, we cannot expect the health workers to remember. So they can use this tape if the mid-arm circumference is falling in the red zone. That means the child has severe malnutrition. If it is falling in the yellow zone, that means the child has borderline nutritional status. Green means the child has normal nutritional status, right? So this is the Shakir's tape. Now a 2.5-year-old, so a 2.5-year-old child is presented to OPD with lethargy and poor appetite. On further probing, the mother revealed that the child has been on exclusive breastfeeding till 2 years. Till what time should exclusive breastfeeding be done? Yes, tell me, exclusive breastfeeding is recommended till what age? Waiting for your replies. See here, exclusive breastfeeding in this question has been done till 2 years of age, which is not what should be done. On examination, what do you get? Malnutrition was found along with edema. If you are getting malnutrition with edema and poor appetite and lethargy, what is your diagnosis? Is it kwashiorkor, marasmus, wasting or stunting? So exclusive breastfeeding should normally be done up to 6 months of age. Beyond that, breast milk alone is not sufficient. You can continue breastfeeding, but complementary feeding should be started. Waiting for your replies. I'll come back to the answer. I can see most of you answering correctly. Very, very good. So proud of you guys. So the two main terminologies here. So wasting and stunting we've already discussed. There's no confusion on this. We are not, thinking about these terms here, right? Okay, because weight for height has not been mentioned. Height for age has not been mentioned. How much it is. Now, kwashiorkors and marasmus are two important terminologies from which you get questions. So kwashiorkor, edema is present. Marasmus, edema is absent. Kwashiorkor, the child has poor appetite, while marasmus, the child has very good appetite. The child wants to eat everything that comes in front of the child. Apathy means lethargy. The child is totally uninterested in doing anything. Apathy is present in kwashiorkor, not present in marasmus. Hepatomegaly, fatty hepatomegaly is present in kwashiorkor, not present in marasmus. Skin and hair changes are also more common in kwashiorkor than marasmus. Okay, what are the skin and hair changes of malnutrition? So skin changes, what do you get? Yes, so flaky paint dermatosis. Just like from old wall, paint comes out. Flaky paint dermatosis. And in the hair, you can get hypopigmentation, easy pluckability, and flag sign. That is alternate bands of pigmented and hypopigmented hairs. Coming back to our question. So very, very important, we saw, remember, kwashiorkor, edema is present. poor appetite is there, and apathy or lethargy or listlessness are there. So these three are the salient features to diagnose kwashiorkor. Coming back to our question, what do you have here? So you have lethargy or apathy is present, poor appetite is there, malnutrition of course is there along with edema. So what is your diagnosis here? There should be no doubt your diagnosis here is kwashiorkor and not marasmus, because there is no edema, the appetite is poor, it is not good as it should be, right? So here you can see that the child on the left, so this child has got malnutrition with edema. So this is a child with kwashiorkor. You can get image-based questions also. You can see there is ascites also, there is swollen extremities. And here, what do you see in the next picture? So in the next picture, you can see that the child has got no edema, is all thin and flail, and so this is a child with marasmus, right? Okay. And in kwashiorkor, it is believed that Calvi plus protein deficiency is predominantly there, right? Now, the child presented with severe vomiting and dehydration. ABCDE was performed. What does D stand for? So whenever a sick child comes to us, we do ABCDE. What is A? A stands for airway. B stands for breathing. We all know C stands for circulation. D stands for yes, Vanshika, Abhay, Hadia, Aditya, Aman, Upmayush, Nish, Sushant, Megha, Bhuvan. Very good. So disability. D stands for disability. That means you see the neurological status, whether the child is able to communicate or the child is having any paresis and all, right? So disability, and E is for exposure. You have to expose the child carefully to see whether any injury or any other manifestations are there. So that is the ABCDE that we use. So D is for disability, not for dehydration, dementia or diarrhea, right? And remember the latest PALS guideline says that whenever a sick child comes to you in the emergency, you should secure IV access. Within how much time? Within 1 minute, you must secure IV access. If you're not able to do that, then it is recommended that we secure intraosseous access, which is usually done in the upper part of tibia in children. Okay. Now, a 16-year-old girl. So a 16-year-old girl presents with short height, primary amenorrhea, widely spaced nipples. Her probable karyotypus. So all these are diagnostic features: short stature, primary amenorrhea, widely spaced nipples. All these are features of Turner syndrome. And I can see all of you answering correctly. Awesome. So Turner syndrome is a condition where there is single X chromosome and no Y chromosome. Normally the total number of chromosomes we have is 46, but in Turner syndrome, single X chromosome, no Y chromosome. So the total number of chromosomes will be 45. So our answer will be 45XO. And because there is no Y chromosome, Turner syndrome is always seen in girls. Okay. And a syndrome which has some clinical features similar to Turner syndrome can be seen in another syndrome. Similar to this is seen in another syndrome. Yes, I'll give you some time to answer this. But before that, so 46XX is the karyotype of a normal girl, 2 X chromosomes, right? 47XXY is seen in Klinefelter syndrome. Yes, I can see so many of you answering correctly. So clinical features similar to Turner syndrome is seen in Noonan syndrome. And Noonan syndrome can be seen in both boys and girls, unlike Turner. So if you are getting 46XX, the karyotype normal girl, 47XXY, Klinefelter syndrome, 46XY is a normal boy. So many questions can come related to this. The most common congenital heart disease in Turner syndrome, what is it? So most common congenital heart disease in Turner syndrome is bicuspid aortic valve. If that is not there in your options, then it is coarctation of aorta. While in Noonan syndrome, most common congenital heart disease is pulmonary stenosis. What do you see in this karyotype? So first is the name of this investigation is karyotype. You must be able to say. Now normally there should be total 46 chromosomes. That means 2 chromosome 1s, 2 chromosome 2s, 2 chromosome 3, 2 chromosome 4 and so on. But here if you count, here the total number of chromosomes is 45 instead of 46. And you can see there is a single X chromosome and there is no Y chromosome. So it is 45XO or Turner syndrome. So you can get an image-based question also like this. So you can see here if you count, the total number of chromosomes is 45 instead of 46, and there's a single X chromosome, no Y chromosome, making it Turner syndrome. Now, your visions on the screen, tell me, what do you see here? Which trisomy is suggested by the karyotyping result shown in this karyotype? So you can see again a karyotype here. So what is your answer? Trisomy 18, trisomy 13, trisomy 21, trisomy 11. Yes, so Turner syndrome was monosomy X also, you could call it. What is your answer here? So yes, very good. Harsh, Aditya, Raghav, Anushka, Rohan, Sushant, Govind. So many of you answering correctly. I'm so happy that I'm not even able to take the names of all of you. So many of you answering correctly. Very good. So you deserve a chocolate at the end of this session from my side, all of you. So here we have, you can see there are 3 copies of chromosome 18. So that means it is trisomy 18. So trisomy 18 or Edwards syndrome is our diagnosis here, E for E. Okay. Trisomy 13 we know is Patau syndrome. Trisomy 21 is Down syndrome. Trisomy 11 does not have a specific name. Identify the pedigree. Yes. So pedigree, 3 golden rules. One is, okay, I'll tell you the first rule at the end. One rule is, if any child is affected and one of the parents is also affected, it is dominant inheritance. Another rule, father to son transmission rules out X-linked inheritance. And the third or the first rule is, if all children of an affected female are affected, then it is mitochondrial inheritance. Now let us see. This female is affected and all her children, this male, this are affected. Again, what do you see here? This female is affected and all her children are affected. What else do you see? You can see this female is affected, all her children are affected. So what is the inheritance here? Yes, what is your diagnosis? So this is very good. So it is mitochondrial or maternal inheritance, right? Okay. A child is brought to the OPD. A child is brought to the OPD with complaint of change in color of urine. So change in color of urine after some time. The urine color is changing. Mother gives history. She noticed a dark black color on the diaper when a baby was few months old. Which enzyme deficiency is present? Urine turns black on standing. N number of times this question has come. Your diagnosis will be what? Tell me the diagnosis. Yes, all of you are answering the enzyme, most of you correctly. What is your diagnosis also I want to know. So the enzyme deficient here will be homogentisic acid oxidase, and the disease in question is, yes, come on, alkaptonuria, right? Very good. Prashant was the first one to answer. Very good. So alkaptonuria is the disease here. So in children, the only manifestation is usually urine turning black on standing, and in adults and older people, you have ochronosis, where you get black spots on the sclera of eye, the ear cartilage, arthritis can be there, and there can be joint involvement as well. So homogentisic acid oxidase deficiency is the answer, right? Phenylalanine hydroxylase deficiency happens in phenylketonuria. Tyrosine aminotransferase deficiency happens. You can get a match the following type of questions also. It is in tyrosinemia. And glucocerebrosidase deficiency you get in Gaucher disease, right? Where there is Gaucher cells with crumpled paper tissue appearance of the cytoplasm. So this is the phenylalanine metabolism pathway, just to give you a quick idea. So we already mentioned phenylalanine hydroxylase deficiency. What you get is phenylketonuria. So that is also a very important disorder. Why? So what are the features that we need to know? So phenylketonuria, what happens is this enzyme is deficient. So normally tyrosine gets converted to phenylalanine gets converted to tyrosine in our body. But in phenylketonuria, this conversion cannot happen. So in phenylketonuria, what happens is tyrosine becomes an essential amino acid. What else? So normally, from this tyrosine, the dopa and the melanin is formed. But in phenylketonuria, the melanin also cannot get formed. So there will be hypopigmentation, blue iris, blonde hairs in phenylketonuria. And what will happen? Excess of phenylalanine will accumulate in the body, causing neurological features like seizures, hypertonia, and there will be accumulation of metabolites like phenylacetate, phenylpyruvate. They will give a mousy or musty odor to the urine. Very good, mousy odor. I can see Mohammad Ojas. Okay, kinky hair, Mohammad Hashim. It is not a feature of phenylketonuria. It is a feature of Menkes disease, which is a defect of copper metabolism. Okay. So here we can also see the homogentisic acid oxidase deficiency, which is responsible for alkaptonuria, right? So phenylketonuria, what we said was mousy or musty odor is there. Tyrosine becomes an essential amino acid, and there is hypopigmentation, we said. And what else? So Guthrie test was a test which was previously done for it. Guthrie test is positive. Okay, right? Now, a 5-year-old child develops fever with erythematous, that means red-colored maculopapular rash. Okay. So very good, I can see. So Menkes disease and Wilson's disease, someone has written. Very good. So Wilson disease, ATP7B gene is affected. Menkes disease, ATP7A gene is affected. Good. She also has cough, conjunctivitis, and coryza. The image of the child is given below. What is the probable diagnosis? Is it measles, chickenpox, erythema infectiosum, hand, foot, mouth disease? Waiting for your answers. Come on, everyone, each and every one of you attending the session must answer, and then I'll tell you the answer. Coming to it in a while. So measles, we have this typical erythematous maculopapular rash and a wet kind of look in the child. There will be a wet look. So there will be erythematous maculopapular rash and a wet kind of look. So there will be coryza, conjunctivitis, so running nose and conjunctivitis, right? And there will be this erythematous maculopapular rash. Coplic spots may also be present. So coplic spots are considered pathognomonic. So they can be present on the buccal mucosa, conjunctiva, vagina. So they have a pearly, pearly white colored and with a red. So there's a red erythematous area in the center. There's a pearly white one. So coplic spots can be present, and there is a long-term complication that is possible. That is sometimes asked. Long-term complication of measles is SSPE, subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. Okay, which is a fatal condition. Chickenpox, the typical manifestation is there is pleomorphic skin rash. That means multiple types of skin rash at the same time. That means you get papule, you get macule, papule, vesicle, okay, pustule. All the lesions can be present at the same time. They come in crops with fever, and the child remains infected till all the lesions have crusted. Remember, erythema infectiosum, also called Pitt disease. So erythema infectiosum is caused by parvovirus B19, and you typically have a slapped cheek appearance of the rash, as if somebody has slapped on the cheek. Okay, so slapped cheek appearance of the rash. Hand, foot, mouth disease, we all know it is a very common illness seen in school-going children. You must have heard in newspapers or from your family members. So hand, foot, mouth disease usually caused by Coxsackie A16, but can be caused by other enteroviruses. So you get, oral ulcers are there, and oral ulcers and blisters are there, and you have blisters and vesicles. So vesicles, blisters, and ulcers on the extremities, especially palms and soles. And low-grade fever and all is there. It is a self-limiting condition, okay, which will resolve spontaneously, not to worry, right? So smallpox is not seen nowadays. Please don't bother about smallpox. It has been eradicated, right? Okay. On an 18-month-old child presented with... Okay, so coming back to a question. Sorry, I didn't answer it for you. So it is fever with erythematous maculopapular rash. Cough is there. Conjunctivitis is there. Coryza is there. This wet look of the child you can see. So all these are features of measles, right? Okay. I'm sure all of you made out the answer before me confirming it. An 18-month-old child presented with runny nose and fever. On examination, there was a rash seen on face. Can you see as if somebody has slapped on the cheek? Slapped cheek appearance of the rash. So that is seen in erythema infectiosum. Not a feature of hand, foot, mouth disease, rubella, or measles. Rubella has got a measles-like rash, but it is a less severe illness, and rubella you also get posterior lymphadenopathy in addition. Now, which vaccines are given at birth? BCG, Hep B, Bird-Dose, MR, BCG, OPV, Hep B, BCG, Hep B, DPT, IPV, Hep B, DPT. So I am giving you time to answer. Till then, let us just a quick recap of the national immunization schedule. The vaccines recommended at birth are BCG, OPV 0 dose, hepatitis B, bird dose. 6 weeks, many vaccines to be given. What all? OPV 1, Rota 1, Penta 1, pneumococcal 1, and fractional IPV 1. 10 weeks, again OPV 2, Rota 2, Penta 2. 14 weeks, what all? So 14 weeks you have OPV 3, Rota 3, Penta 3, PCV 2, FIPV 2. So 14 weeks is just like your 6 weeks. 5 vaccines are there, right? 9 to 12 months, what all to be given? So 9 to 12 months, MR1, PCV booster. FIPV third dose has been recently introduced, Jan 2023, it has been introduced at 9 to 12 months. And Japanese encephalitis 1 in endemic areas. 16 to 24 months, what is recommended? So MR2, DPT booster 1, OPV booster, Japanese encephalitis second dose. 5 to 6 years, the boosters of DPT, second dose. And 10 to 16 years, previously TT was there, now TT, tetanus and small dose of diphtheria. Okay, right. So coming back to this question, please answer properly. So which vaccines are given at birth? No mistake permissible here. BCG is given, we know. Hep B, yes. MR, is MR given at birth? No. It is given at 9 months. What about BCG, OPV, Hep B birth dose? Yes, that is the best answer. And which all are not given? DPT is not given at birth and IPV is not given at birth. Okay, right? Okay, so moving ahead. First dose of measles vaccine was given on 7 months of age due to some reason. When will you schedule the child for next dose? So if you give a first dose of measles before 9 months, we do not count that dose. So you must give the first dose again at 9 months and then the next dose at 16 to 24 months, remember. Okay, right? Moving ahead, 2 open vials of pentavalent vaccine and 1 open vial of MR vaccine is given back after an immunization session. What to do with these vials? Can you reuse it or should you discard both the vials? I'll come back to answer this question. First, a little bit about open vial policy. Now this open vial policy, why did it come? So it came to prevent vaccine wastage. Okay, to prevent vaccine wastage, this open vial policy came, and it allows reuse of partially used multi-dose vaccine vials. Okay, provided certain conditions are met. Up to 4 weeks you can reuse them. So if the label is intact, the VVM shows that the vaccine is usable, the expiry date has not passed, the vaccine is not frozen, and septum is not leaking, date and time of mentioning the vaccine is mentioned, opening the vaccine is mentioned. In that case, you can reuse some of the vaccines that follow open vial policy, not all. What is this? So this has come as a question previously. This is a VVM. What is the full form of VVM? Yes, I want each and every one of you to know what is the full form of VVM. Vaccine vial monitor. Okay. So vaccine vial monitor tells you whether a vaccine has incurred heat damage or not. If the inner square is lighter in color than the outer circle, that means you can use the vaccine. But if it is the same color or darker in color, you cannot use the vaccine. Very important. Okay. Now the open vial policy, remember, is not applicable for BCG and measles containing vaccine does not follow open vial policy. Some strains of Rota and JE also do not follow, some follow. Most of the vaccines follow open vial policy. But remember, freeze-dried vaccines like BCG and measles containing vaccine like MR does not follow open vial policy. You cannot reuse it in the next session. You can use it at that session only. Okay. So coming back to our question, what should you do with those vials? Both should be discarded? No, we don't want to discard and waste both the vials. Pentavalent can be used. Yes. MR must be discarded. Yes, that is the best answer. MR cannot be used. Both vials can be reused. So B is the best answer. Right. Moving ahead. So, a child presents with abdominal pain, hematuria, and palpable purpura over the legs. You can see these purpura spots are palpable and raised from the surface. Skin lesions show IgA deposition or biopsy. What is your diagnosis? Is it idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, henoch-Schwann purpura, acute leukemia, or post-streptococcal bronchiolitis? Yes. So, I can see Aman, Prachi, Varshini, Himani, Gokula, Mohammed. Come on, everyone should answer. Pavan, Shiva. So, make a habit of answering. Let no question go unanswered. Okay, you must answer. Right. So, I can see all of you almost have answered correctly. So, yes, it is henoch-Schwann purpura. When do you call it henoch-Schwann purpura? So palpable purpura with at least one out of the following. What all? So pain abdomen, or arthritis or arthralgia may be there, or any evidence of renal involvement, or any biopsy showing IgA deposition. Okay, any of these are present along with palpable purpura, it is henoch-Schwann purpura. And remember, thrombocytopenia is absent. In henoch-Schwann purpura, thrombocytopenia is absent. Usually, it is a self-limiting illness. Now, according to neonatal resuscitation protocol, chest compression is initiated at heart rate below 80, 75, 70, 60. I want again all of you to answer and I'll come back to answer this question. Waiting for your replies. Let's go through the neonatal resuscitation algorithm, a quick recap. So it starts with antenatal counseling, team briefing, equipment check. Then the baby is born. You ask 3 questions. Whether it is term gestation or not, good muscle tone, breathing or crying. Awesome. Most of you are answering correctly. A couple of you have answered properly. Please see again. So if the answer to all the questions are yes, the baby stays with mother, gets routine care. But if the answer to any of these questions is no, you stimulate the baby. What do you see next? If the baby has apnea, or gasping or heart rate less than 100 per minute, start positive pressure ventilation. And use a pulse oximeter, consider ECG monitor. If there is labored breathing or persistent cyanosis, then you monitor the SpO2, supplementary oxygen if required, and consider CPAP. Finally, post-resuscitation care, team debriefing. Now you can see, again we keep on monitoring the heart rate. If the heart rate is still below 100 per minute, again you see whether your bag and mask ventilation or positive pressure ventilation is happening properly or not. But if the heart rate is below 60 per minute, what do? Intubate if not already done, start chest compressions. Coordinate with PPV and use 100% oxygen. So when you start doing positive pressure ventilation, you can do it at room air. No need to give oxygen. But once you're doing chest compressions, 100% oxygen must be given. And use a ECG monitor and emergency UVC. If this heart rate is still below 60 per minute, IV, epinephrine or adrenaline has to be given. The target oxygen saturation at 1 minute, you'll be surprised to know, is only 60 to 65%. If that is the saturation, no oxygen is required. 2 minutes, 65 to 70%, 10 minutes, 85 to 95%. If this is the saturation, no oxygen is required. Coming back to the question. So according to neonatal resuscitation protocol, chest compression is initiated at heart rate below 60 per minute. No confusion on this. Now, according to neonatal resuscitation protocol, how much oxygen to be given in a term neonate with apnea and bradycardia initially? So if a term neonate is having apnea and bradycardia, what will you do? Positive pressure ventilation using bag and mask. Initially, when you start giving positive pressure ventilation, we always start with, yes, Raksha, Mohammed, Megha, Vaibhav, Samaditra, Aman, Anshul. So it is 21%. We start with room air. Only if the baby is not improving, we slowly add oxygen. Chest compressions, where do you give it? So you give it in the midline. Okay, and we give it in the lower, on the lower 1/3 of body of sternum, not on the zippy sternum. And you give it, in the just in the midline, just below the line joining the two nipples. The techniques, there are two techniques. There is a 2-finger technique like this and a 2-thumb encircling technique. So the 2-thumb encircling technique is preferred over the 2-finger technique. The ratio. So whenever you are giving chest compression, you remember you also have to give positive pressure ventilation. So what is the ratio? So the ratio of chest compression is to positive pressure ventilation is always 3:1. That means you give 3 chest compressions, 1 breath. So 1 and 2 and 3 and squeeze. 1 and 2 and 3 and squeeze. So like that, you give 3 chest compressions and 1 breath. That should be 1/3 of the anteroposterior diameter of the chest. Right? And you start chest compression only when the heart rate is less than how much? 60 per minute. But if despite 1 minute of chest compression, the heart rate continues to be less than 60, you have to give injection adrenaline. So here there's a latest update. So here the dose of injection adrenaline has now recently been revised to 0.02 mg per kg per dose. Okay, 0.02 mg per kg per dose. Okay, or 0.2 ml per kg per dose of 1 in 10,000 adrenaline. And the preferred route is intravenous through the umbilical venous catheter. Okay, through the umbilical venous catheter. So here there is no difference, Rajkiran. Even if 2 doctors are there, the ratio still remains 3:1 in neonatal resuscitation. Okay. Identify the abnormality in the following X-ray of a newborn with respiratory distress. Is it congenital diaphragmatic hernia or tracheoesophageal fistula with esophageal atresia, pneumothorax, or hyaline membrane disease? What do you see? So let me magnify it for you. What do you see? Can you see that the bowel loops are there in the thorax and there is mediastinal shift and you can hardly see any lungs? So this is a typical chest X-ray of congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Okay. Congenital diaphragmatic hernia has come multiple times as a spotter. You can see that the bowel gas shadows are there in the thorax. I'm sure all of you are able to appreciate these bowel gas shadows in the thorax, right? It is congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Now remember, congenital diaphragmatic hernia, so this is an absolute contraindication for bag and mask. Okay, for bag and mask ventilation. If it is a known case of congenital diaphragmatic hernia, or if you're suspecting congenital diaphragmatic hernia, you must not do bag and mask ventilation. If the baby has distress, you have to intubate the baby. Okay, what do you see here? Some more spotters for you? Yes. What do you see here? Can you see a tube-like thing coiled here? So this is a baby with esophageal atresia, usually associated with a tracheoesophageal fistula. Okay, esophageal atresia. So it is a tracheoesophageal fistula with esophageal atresia. Feeding tube is not able to go in the esophagus, it is getting coiled here, right? Okay, what do you see here? Come on, so I have just included a few more spotters for you so that you do not get bowled out whatever the question is, right? So what do you see here? So you can see free air in the chest cavity and you can see this is the lung margin. Okay, so if there is air inside the chest cavity and the lungs are getting collapsed, what is your diagnosis? Yes, very good guys. So this is pneumothorax. You must be able to identify pneumothorax. You can see in this black area there are no bronchovascular markings. Okay, there are no bronchovascular markings in this black area. This is pneumothorax. Okay, what do you see here? So can you appreciate the lungs of the baby here? It has a totally diffuse ground glass appearance, ground glass haziness of lungs. So this is typically what you see in respiratory distress syndrome or hyaline membrane disease. Okay, hyaline membrane disease, ground glass appearance of lungs. Okay, right? So we have seen the other options also here. We've seen what a tracheoesophageal fistula with esophageal atresia looks like, what a pneumothorax looks like, and what hyaline membrane disease looks like. Okay, so moving ahead, what is the daily fluid requirement of a 4-day-old baby with a birth weight of 1300 grams? Now, how to calculate how much fluid to give to a neonate, whether it is 80 ml per kg per day, 90 or 105 or 120 ml per kg per day. So the fluid requirement in neonates. Remember, if the baby's birth weight is less, okay, less than 1500 grams, you start on day 1 with 80 ml per kg per day of fluid. Okay, and you go on increasing every day 10 to 15 ml. Okay, you go on increasing 10 to 15 ml every day. So day 2 it will be 95, day 3 it will be 110, day 4 would be 120. Our question is asking weight is less than 1500, that means weight is 1300. Day 4 you have to give 120 ml per kg per day. Day 7, the neonate, day 7 and beyond, we give 150 ml per kg per day. Okay, 150 ml per kg per day. If the birth weight is more, if it is more than 1500, greater than or equal to 1500, you start with lesser fluid. Okay, 60 ml per kg per day, and again you keep on increasing by 15 to 20 ml per kg per day, 15 ml per kg per day to be precise, and finally by day 7 it reaches 150 ml per kg per day. So coming back to our question, so fluid requirement in the baby birth weight is less than 1500 grams. Day 4 it is going to be 120 ml per kg per day. So in babies with lesser birth weight, less than 1500, you start with 80 ml per kg per day. In babies with birth weight more than 1500, you start with 60 ml per kg per day. You go on increasing by day 7, it becomes 150 ml per kg per day. Now that was in a neonate. What about older children? If an older child requires IV fluid, how do you calculate the 24-hour maintenance fluid requirement in children? Okay, so in children for first 10 kgs, we use the holiday cigar method. The first 10 kgs you have to give 10, so you have to give 100 ml per kg per day. Okay, so 20 per maintenance required. Next 10 kgs you will give 50 ml per kg, and beyond 20 kgs you will give 20 ml per kg. So I'll just give you a quick example. Suppose the weight of a child is 24 kgs. How do you calculate the maintenance fluid? So 24 kgs is the weight of the child. Okay. So for first 10 kgs you will give 100 ml per kg. So you will give 10 into 100, that is 1000 ml. For the next 10 kgs you will give 50 ml per kg per day. So you'll give 50. So you'll give 10 into 50. So that is 500 ml. And for the next 4 kgs you will give 20 ml per kg per day. So 4 into 20 is 80. So the total comes to 1580. So you will give 1580 ml per kg per day. Okay. The fluid of choice in children is nowadays it is believed to be DNS, dextrose normal saline, with added potassium. If that is not there in your options, you can choose N/2 in 5% dextrose. That is half normal saline with dextrose with added potassium. So that is how you calculate it, right? Now all are signs of adequate breastfeeding in a 2-month-old infant except. So if the baby is feeding adequately, baby sleeps for 2 to 3 hours after feeding, yes. Urinates 6 to 7 times per day, yes. Gains weight, yes. Don't forget to see the word except, okay? If you don't see the except, what will you do? The first option you will mark as correct. Baby sleeps 2 to 3 hours after feeding, that means adequate feeding. Don't do that. Please read the question very, very carefully, especially the words like except. So your best answer is has normal hemoglobin level. That has nothing to do with whether breastfeeding is adequate or not, okay? So that is the best answer. You must know signs of good feeding, good positioning while feeding, breastfeeding, good attachment while breastfeeding, okay? Now which of the following is true about the swelling of head present in a 3-day-old neonate? Its size is maximum at birth, resolves in 7 to 10 days, it is limited by periosteum due to edema in the layers of scalp. So first you have to tell me whether it is cephalhematoma or capered subcutaneum, and then we can tell what is true or false about this. So let us first discuss about two very important swellings, cephalhematoma, capered subcutaneum. Cephalhematoma is a hematoma, so it is subperiosteal hemorrhage involving the cranial bones. Okay, cranial bones. While what is capered subcutaneum, it is basically due to edema in the layers of scalp. Right? Cephalhematoma. What happens is this is the bone, okay, and this is the periosteum. And this is blood in between the bone and periosteum. So it can either be present on one side of midline or separate swellings can be present on both the sides of midline. But it does not cross sutures. The swelling does not cross sutures or midline usually. While what happens in capered subcutaneum? Capered subcutaneum, this is the bone, this is the periosteum, and there is edema in the layers of scalp. There is edema here. So this in here, in capered subcutaneum, the swelling can cross sutures or midline. Okay, right? So capered subcutaneum, the swelling can cross sutures, while cephalhematoma does not cross sutures. Cephalhematoma takes time to appear also, disappear also. So cephalhematoma appears in 48 to 72 hours after birth and disappears by 5 to 7 weeks. While capered subcutaneum is usually present at birth in its maximum size. At birth in its maximum size and disappears by 48 to 72 hours. 48 to 72 hours. And because cephalhematoma is a collection of blood, it predisposes to neonatal jaundice, but capered does not. Now here what you see in the picture, it is a unilateral swelling. Okay, the swelling is unilateral on one side of the midline. Okay, and it is present even in a 3-day-old neonate. That means 72 hours also it is present. So this is a cephalhematoma. Okay. Now the question is asking which of the following is true about this. So cephalhematoma is the size is maximum at birth. Is it true? No. The size can increase for 40 to 72 hours. It resolves in 7 to 10 days. No. It takes 5 to 7 weeks to disappear. It is limited by periosteum. Yes, it is limited by periosteum. And it is due to edema in the layers of scalp. No. Capered subcutaneum is due to edema in layers of scalp, not cephalhematoma. Very important, you must be able to identify what is the swelling and you need to know the characteristics and differences between cephalhematoma and capered subcutaneum. Okay? Now, a 3-month-old baby presents with fever, respiratory rate of 68 per minute. He is feeding well, no stridor, no chest indrawing, no convulsions. What is the diagnosis? Is it pneumonia, severe pneumonia, very severe pneumonia, no pneumonia? So this you have to diagnose using the IMNCI guidelines. What is IMNCI? So these are some algorithms given by WHO, that is integrated management of neonatal and childhood illnesses. Neonatal and childhood illnesses. Okay, so let us see what. So first thing that you have to see in this case is whether fast breathing is there or not. When do you call it fast breathing? Less than 2 months age if the respiratory rate is more than 60 per minute. 2 to 12 months of age if the respiratory rate is more than 50 per minute. 1 to 5 years age respiratory rate is more than 40 per minute. In our case the child's age is how much? 3 months. Respiratory rate is 68. It is more than 50 per minute. So fast breathing is present here, right? Fast breathing is present. Okay. Now, what are the general danger signs? General danger signs are like convulsions or seizures, lethargy, inability to feed, persistent vomitings, okay, persistent vomiting, unconsciousness. So if any of these are present, we say the general danger sign is present. Okay. Now let us see the IMNCI classification. Okay. If there is any general danger sign or stridor in a calm child, we call it severe pneumonia or very severe disease. What will you do? You stabilize the child, give first dose antibiotics, and you refer. Because it is a severe pneumonia or very severe disease, so peripheral health workers cannot manage it further. But if chest indrawing or fast breathing is present, or both are present, or one of them is present, we call it pneumonia. Like in our case, chest indrawing is not there, but fast breathing is present, so you call it pneumonia. What do? So you prescribe oral antibiotics like amoxicillin for 5 days. Okay, review after 48 hours. No need for hospitalization. Okay, child stays at home, right? And if there is, no general danger sign, no stridor, no fast breathing, no chest indrawing, nothing, then it is cough and cold only, it is no pneumonia. So you only give home-based supportive care. So that is how you classify the child and manage. Now if anything is written in a pink background, that means it is a severe condition. You must refer the child quickly. Anything written in a yellow background means the child can be managed with, with home-based care, but specific treatment is required, like oral antibiotics here. And green means no specific treatment is required, just home-based supportive care. So that is the IMNCI categorization. Now coming back to our question. So here fast breathing is there, no chest indrawing is there, and no general danger sign. So the child is classified into what category? What category? Pneumonia. And you will give oral antibiotics and the child will be sent through, right? So that is how you approach these kind of questions. You can be asked about the category, you can be asked about the management, you can be asked about when you call it fast breathing, you can be asked about color coding. What does pink, yellow, or green mean in IMNCI? Okay. Now, a few more quickies. Most common cause of inspiratory stridor in an infant is infant laryngomalacia. Okay, and it is usually a self-limiting condition. And here you get omega-shaped epiglottis. Nothing needs to be done. It usually, resolves on its own. It's not parenfluenza epiglottitis or vocal cord palsy. A child with difficulty in breathing had steeple sign. So steeple sign on X-ray. There was low-grade fever, stridor only on crying. What is the treatment? Before treatment, you have to tell me what is the diagnosis here. Okay, then we'll be coming to treatment. Whether it is antibiotic steroid, oral steroid, antibiotic of suppressant, we assure the patient. So our diagnosis here is, yes, who will tell me? Very good. Patel, Taj, and I can see Nanta and Ojas and many of you answering Aman. So it is group, or it is also called acute LTB, laryngotracheobronchitis. Let us discuss a little bit about it, then we come back to answer this question. So croup, the etiology is mainly viruses, okay, like parainfluenza virus, most common being parainfluenza virus. While acute epiglottitis is a more severe condition, it is mainly caused by bacteria. Previously, H influenzae was the most common cause, but now because in pentavalent vaccine everyone is getting H influenza vaccination, now the most common cause is streptococcus in vaccinated population. Okay, clinical presentation in croup would be low grade fever, stridor, barking cough. Okay. And there can be some hypoxia can be there, okay, coryza will be there, so it is not a very sick kind of a child. But acute epiglottitis, the child is very, very sick. There is high grade fever, drooling of saliva, the child is not even able to swallow his own saliva, and toxic look, sick looking child. X-ray picture in croup, we know we get the steeple sign. Acute epiglottitis, we get the what sign? Yes, thumb sign. Okay, treatment. Croup is a viral illness, you saw croup, parainfluenza virus, it is a viral illness, no role of antibiotics. Okay, no role of antibiotics as such in croup unless you are suspecting secondary infection of by bacteria. So no role of antibiotics. So what do? Mild illness, you give single dose dexamethasone. And of course, if required, you can give supportive care, oxygen and all, single dose dexamethasone. And moderate to severe illness, you give nebulized epinephrine as well. Nebulized epinephrine along with humidified oxygen, respiratory support and so on. Okay. What about acute epiglottitis? Acute epiglottitis is a bacterial illness. So in addition to supportive care, oxygen, what will you give? IV, third generation cephalosporin. So IV antibiotics need to be given in acute epiglottitis, plus supportive care, oxygen if required, respiratory support, ventilation and so on. Okay, and you can see this is the thumb sign in acute epiglottitis, and you can see this is the steeple sign. So the airways is appearing like the steeple of a church in croup, right? So image based questions also covered here, right? So coming back to our question, so this is a case of croup. And there was some difficulty in breathing, low grade fever, stridor only on crying. That means it's not a very severe condition. No hypoxia and all is also mentioned. So what will be the treatment of choice? Antibiotic with steroid and oxygen. Do you want to give antibiotic here in croup? No. Oral steroid? Yes, we can give oral steroid. Antibiotic cough suppressant with decongestant? No. Reassuring the patient alone will not help. So our best answer is oral steroid. So single dose oral or intramuscular steroids suffice. Dexamethasone is the steroid of choice. Now, a child with CFTR gene mutation is there. Okay. Mutation word has got somehow omitted. So a child with CFTR mutation is there. Which of the following ion channels are affected? What is your diagnosis here? You have to tell. So the ion channel affected we all know is chloride. Okay, and this is a condition where the sweat chloride levels are elevated to more than 60 milliequivalent per liter. The diagnosis here is, yes, what is the diagnosis here? Waiting for your answers. So the child will present with recurrent pneumonias, failure to thrive, steatorrhea, fat or oil in stool. Family history may be positive. So diagnosis here, yes, very good guys, it is cystic fibrosis. Infection with pseudomonas, Burkholderia, all these are there. Recurrent pneumonias will be there. So this is cystic fibrosis. Now, slightly big question, don't get bogged down. Nowadays, you're getting more and more such bigger questions. But if you read it, trust me, it is very, very simple. I want you to answer it. Okay, let's read the question together. So a few more questions to go. I think I'll take around 10-15 minutes more. So you can have, a quick drink of water or something if you want. So let's maintain the pace. Okay, so a 3-year-old child presented with recurrent episodes of diarrhea, abdominal distension. Diarrhea is there, abdominal distension is there. On examination, he was found to have anemia, short stature, failure to thrive. Failure to thrive means not gaining weight adequately. An upper GI endoscopy was done along with duodenal biopsy, revealed villous atrophy. What is the antibody that will be elevated in this child? First, you have to give me the diagnosis. Yes? What is the diagnosis? Who can tell me what is the diagnosis first? So, what is our diagnosis here? So, Aftab, Patel, Taj, Deshraj, very good. So, our diagnosis here is definitely, I think all of you can make out, it is celiac disease, where there is sensitivity to gluten, mainly wheat. Okay, right? Because there is recurrent episodes of diarrhea is there, abdomen is distended, there is short stature, failure to thrive, there could be iron deficiency anemia, and upper GI endoscopy, duodenal biopsy is done for diagnosis. You find villous atrophy, and you can also find crypt hyperplasia, intraepithelial lymphocytes. So this is a child with celiac disease. What is the antibody that is used to diagnose celiac disease? So I'll be coming back to this question. So celiac disease, the most sensitive test is anti-TTG IgA. And you should always do a total IgA along with it if possible. So anti-TTG, what is TTG? Tissue transglutaminase antibody. So my pen looks like a bit tired. Just give me a second. It's not working. Right. So it is anti-tissue transglutaminase antibody. Oh, just a minute, please. So it is anti-tissue transglutaminase antibody. Let me just come back. Okay, so anti-TTG is anti-tissue transglutaminase antibody. Right? And the most specific antibody is anti-EMA, that is anti-endomysial antibody. Anti-endomysial antibody. Okay, or anti-EMA. Right? Okay. So coming back to our question, so this is a child with cystic celiac disease, so we know the antibody that will be elevated is anti-tissue transglutaminase antibody or anti-TTG. ANA or anti-nuclear antibody is elevated in which disease? SLE. Similarly, anti-dsDNA is also elevated in SLE. ANA actually is a very non-specific one, and it can be elevated in multiple, collagen vascular diseases or connective tissue disorders. And anti-streptolysin O antibody is elevated in conditions like rheumatic fever. So it indicates a previous streptococcal infection. Right? Okay. So anti-tissue transglutaminase antibody is the best answer, and you have to avoid wheat and wheat products, right? Maybe. Lifelong gluten-free diet is the treatment of choice. Now, moving ahead, what you have here is a 3-year-old child. So just a minute, my video was lagging. Yeah. So we have a 3-year-old child with diarrhea for 2 days and was irritable, extremely thirsty. There was no history of vomiting. What is the next step? Will you give IV normal saline, IV ringal lactate, oral rehydration solution, oral juices? I will let you answer this question. We'll first discuss how to assess dehydration in a child with diarrhea. Very, very, very important. Almost every other exam you get this question. So the 3 most important things to see are the sensorium, the thirst, and the skin pinch. These are the 3 most important things that you're going to see. Okay, right? So sensorium. If the child is alert and active, it is no dehydration. If the child is irritable, it is some dehydration, and in severe dehydration the child is lethargic and dull and floppy. Okay, what about eyes? So eyes would remain, the eyes would remain normal. So eyes would be normal in no dehydration, sunken in some dehydration, and very sunken. Again, it is very, very subjective in severe dehydration. Tears present in no dehydration, absent in some and severe dehydration. Mucosa is normal, wet mucosa in no dehydration, dry and very dry in severe dehydration. But as I told you, the most important things are sensorium, thirst, skin pain. We saw the sensorium. What about the thirst? In no dehydration, the child's thirst is normal. The child is not thirsty, not excessively thirsty. In some dehydration, what will happen? In some dehydration, the child is very thirsty, wants to drink a lot, very thirsty. Okay, excessive thirst is there. Okay, while in severe dehydration, the child is not able to drink. The child is so dull, the child is not able to drink or breastfeed. Okay, skin pinch. Now, skin pinch goes back normally in no dehydration. Goes back slowly in some dehydration, but it takes less than 2 seconds, and goes back very slowly in severe dehydration, taking more than 2 seconds. So that is how you have to say whether it is no, some, or severe dehydration. If the child is falling in no dehydration, then as per IMNCI, the child is in green category. If the child is falling in some dehydration, the child is in yellow category as per IMNCI. And if the child is having severe dehydration, the child is in again pink category as per IMNCI. Clear? Now, how do you treat dehydration? Now, if there is no dehydration, do you still want to give ORS? Yes. Why? To prevent dehydration. Because the child is going on losing fluid through stool. You must replace it. So you give oral rehydration solution. Oral rehydration solution, even if there is no dehydration. How much will you give? You will give 5 to 10 ml per kg per loose stool. Okay. Some dehydration, if it is there, again you will give ORS. How much? 75 ml per kg over 4 hours. But if the child is having excessive vomiting, then you might have to give IV fluids. The child may not be able to take orally. While severe dehydration, we treat it with IV fluids only, mainly. And if the child is able to take orally, you can, add on ORS. So IV fluid of choice is RL in 5% extrudes. If that is not available, you can use either RL or normal saline. Okay, dextrose alone is not used. Now, in severe dehydration, we said how much fluid is to be required? 100 ml per kg. How do you give this 100 ml per kg? We split it in first 30 ml per kg, next 70 ml per kg. If the child's age is less than 1 year, we give first 30 ml per kg over 1 hour, next 70 ml per kg over 5 hours. So total time taken is 6 hours for correction, 100 ml per kg. While if the child is more than 1 year, we can give first 30 ml per kg in half the time, next 70 ml per kg also half the time. So total time taken would be 3 hours. Okay. Now, about the treatment of diarrhea in children, 3 things are there. First, fluid replacement either by ORS or IV fluid. Second, you add zinc. It helps in faster recovery, prevents recurrent episodes. Third is continue normal home-based diet. Don't give chips and kurkure. Okay. So coming back to our question. Now here the question: the child is irritable and extremely thirsty. Which category of dehydration it is? Yes. So it is some dehydration. So what is the next step? The child is not having any vomiting. No vomiting. So what should be your best answer? So it should be, come on. So not IV normal saline or inhaled lactate, no oral juices. Juices will increase the diarrhea, osmotic diuresis. So it is oral rehydration solution or ORS. WHO ORS. Okay, in proper dilution. So treatment of acute diarrhea in children we already discussed. You have to give fluid replacement, you have to give zinc therapy and continue normal diet. Right? Composition of WHO ORS, we all know it has a sodium of 75 millimoles and glucose also 75, potassium 20, chloride 65, citrate 10, making a total of 245 milliosmoles or millimoles per liter is the osmolarity of the new WHO ORS, also called the reduced osmolarity ORS. Okay, so this is to be given in proper dilution, right? Now, a child with diarrhea was eager to drink. Eager to drink means thirsty, right? And the skin pinch went back slowly. So that means the child has what? Thirst is increased, skin pinch goes back slowly. Which category of dehydration? The child is classified in which of the categories as per INNCI? So which category of dehydration it is? Yes, so it is very good, guys. So it is some dehydration. So it has to be yellow category, as we already mentioned. Now, a 6-year-old girl child, mind you, read the question. 6-year-old girl child presented with a boil on the leg 3 weeks ago is now presenting with cola-colored urine, periorbital puffiness. On examination, the blood pressure is 158/92. That means there is hypertension. What is the probable diagnosis? Is it minimal change disease, IgA nephropathy, post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, nodular glomerulosclerosis? So we'll come back to answer this question. First, let us discuss a little bit about nephritic syndrome. When do you call it nephritic syndrome in children? So when there is hypertension or high blood pressure, oliguria, that means less urine output is there, and there is some edema, not as much edema as you get in nephrotic syndrome, but some edema is there, and on investigation you get proteinuria. But proteinuria is not massive, it is nephritic range proteinuria. Nephritic range proteinuria. So nephritic range proteinuria, that means 1+ or 2+ proteins are there, and what else? In urine you get RBC casts, and you're getting cola-colored urine. Okay, urine RBC casts or granular casts are there, and the complement levels would be low, C3 levels would be low. So all these are findings of nephritic syndrome, and the most common cause of nephritic syndrome in children is PSDN or post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. So coming back to answer our question, so you can see there's a history of previous streptococcal infection, also boil on the leg was there 3 weeks ago. The child has cola-colored urine, edema is there or periorbital puffiness, hypertension is there. So our diagnosis here is nephritic syndrome, and the most common cause of nephritic syndrome is not minimal changes, not IgA nephropathy, it is post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Okay, in children. Moving ahead, so generalized edema and massive proteinuria in a child is most commonly seen. So if you're getting massive proteinuria, what will be your diagnosis? So it will be, yes, massive proteinuria you get in nephrotic syndrome. In children, when do you call it massive proteinuria? When the urine protein is to urine creatinine ratio is more than 2, greater than equal to 2, we call it massive proteinuria. Or urine protein by dipstick is 3+ or more, we call it massive proteinuria. Okay, so generalized edema, massive proteinuria, hypoalbuminemia, lipidemia or lipiduria can be there. Our diagnosis is nephrotic syndrome. Most common cause of nephrotic syndrome in children is what? So it is minimal change disease, where on light microscopy the kidney biopsy is normal. Electron microscopy with flattening of the foot plate of porocytes. Treatment of nephrotic syndrome in children, initial episode, the drug of choice, prednisolone. Relapse also drug of choice, prednisolone. Okay, steroid dependent nephrotic syndrome, the drug of choice, low dose alternate day steroids or prednisolone. And if the child is having features of steroid toxicity, then you can give levamisole or cyclophosphamide, right? And the drug of choice for SRNS or steroid resistant nephrotic syndrome is calcineurin inhibitors. Like, you can give me some examples. Calcineurin inhibitors, can you give me some examples? Like cyclosporin and tacrolimus. Okay, so that is about nephrotic syndrome in children. Renal agenesis in a baby is associated with single umbilical artery. Okay, normally in umbilical cord there is one umbilical vein. Vein is one and there are 2 umbilical arteries. If there is a single umbilical artery, it is associated with increased risk of renal anomalies. And in the fetus, remember, it is the umbilical vein that carries oxygenated blood and not umbilical artery. Umbilical artery carries deoxygenated blood. Okay, what could be the possible diagnosis for newborn exhibiting weak lower limb pulses and strong upper limb pulses? So if the lower limb pulses are weak, upper limb pulses are strong, that means there must be some constriction in the arch of aorta. So the upper limb is getting adequate blood supply, lower limb is not getting adequate blood supply. And we know a narrowing in aorta, constriction in aorta is called coarctation of aorta. So if you are getting feeble femoral pulses or weak femoral pulses or absent dorsalis pedis pulses, think of coarctation of aorta. Okay, not TGA, which is a cyanotic heart disease, which will not have weak lower limb pulses. Tetralogy of Fallot also, cyanosis will be there, but no weak lower limb pulses. Epstein anomaly also, there will be no weak lower limb pulses. A few spotters for you. Come on, rapid fire, back in the gear. So this is egg on side appearance. Egg on side appearance, where do you get? Egg on side appearance you get in TGA or transposition of great arteries. Okay, this is egg on side appearance. Okay, just imprint the pictures in your mind. So what do you see here? So this is a figure of 3 appearance. That means here there is a narrowing in the arch of aorta. So figure of 3, you get in coarctation of aorta. What else do you get in coarctation of aorta? You can also get notching of inferior margin of ribs. You can see the notching of inferior margin of ribs. Notching of inferior margin of ribs. Okay, in coarctation of aorta. And what do you see here? So this, I'm sure all of you will be able to answer. A boot that you see here, boot-shaped heart. Boot-shaped heart is seen in which condition? Tetralogy of Fallot. You must remember the components of tetralogy of Fallot. Large VSD, pulmonary stenosis, overriding of aorta, and right ventricular hypertrophy. Most common congenital cyanotic heart disease in children is tetralogy of Fallot. What do you see here? So it's a box-shaped heart. It's huge cardiomegaly involving the entire thorax almost. Which condition? So yes, can someone answer? 2 chocolates from my side then. Yes, so box-shaped heart is seen in. Waiting for your reply. No one? So the chocolate to me, Epstein anomaly, box-shaped heart. Okay. So what condition is likely in a newborn presenting with? What all is there? So newborn is there with constipation, distended abdomen, umbilical hernia, dry rough mottle skin, big protruding tongue, rough hair. All these are features of congenital hypothyroidism. You can see the protruding tongue, you can see the umbilical hernia, distended abdomen, constipation is mentioned. All these are features of congenital hypothyroidism. The most common cause of congenital hypothyroidism in children is thyroid dysgenesis. That means thyroid gland has not developed properly. Ideally, newborn screening should be done. Newborn screening should be done. Usually it is done using the cord blood TSH levels, thyroid stimulating hormone levels. Okay, you can also do it from a heel prick sample, right? It is not Prader-Willi syndrome where there is obesity, developmental delay, dysmorphism. It's not Edwards syndrome where there is trisomy 18, not galactosemia where you get bilateral oil drop, cataracts, jaundice and all. And okay, so nausea, vomiting, jaundice and diarrhea and all. So which of the following is the most common seizure found in the age group of less than 5 years? So less than 5 years, most common cause of seizures is febrile seizures. It's not myoclonic. Subtle seizures, remember, is most common in neonates. Okay, but in children less than 5 years of age, the most common cause of seizure is febrile seizure. Febrile seizures can be simple febrile seizures or complex febrile seizures. Okay, and febrile seizures when there is significant fever. Seizures, significant fever, that means more than 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, plus seizures without any evidence of CNS infection, only then we call it febrile seizures. Okay, in the typical age group, what is the age group? 6 months to 5 years. So that is the definition of febrile seizures. Significant fever, seizures without any evidence of CNS infection in the age group of 6 months to 5 years. When do you call it simple febrile seizures? If it lasts for, so simple febrile seizure lasts for less than 15 minutes and it is generalized and only single episodes in each episode of fever. Single episode of seizure during one episode of fever. Then it is simple febrile. What will be complex febrile? Lasting for more than 15 minutes, focal seizures or recurrent seizures. Okay. Simple febrile seizure, no long-term anti-epileptics are required. Now, a child presented with a birth defect shown in the image. What is the diagnosis? You can see there is a defect of almost the entire spine. Entire spine is exposed to outside. Okay, the brain also you can see and the entire spine. So it is not anencephaly, not myelomeningocele, not encephalocele. It is craniorachystysis, where you can see that the cranial defect is also there and there is a defect of the upper part of spine. So this question has come recently in your FMG exams. Now about the other disorders, what is your diagnosis here? So I believe just one more question to go. Some more energy I want here. Yes, what is the diagnosis here quickly? So you can see a swelling in the lumbosacral region, which is the most common location of this condition. Yes. What is the diagnosis? This is also a type of neural tube defect and it is called myelomeningocele. Okay, myelomeningocele most commonly seen in the lumbosacral region. It is also a neural tube defect. Okay. What do you see here? What is the congenital CNS abnormality? You can see that the cranium, the scalp, the cranium is absent and brain is exposed to outside and brain is not developed properly also. Come on, this one I want an answer from each and every one of you. What is your diagnosis here? So this is due to failure of development of the rostral end of the neuropode or anterior neuropode. Yes? Come on, what is the answer? Yes? So Prachi, very good. Manohar. So I can see now a lot of you answering, Aman. So yes, this is anencephaly. This is one of those conditions where you do not resuscitate a baby if this defect is present. Okay? I believe this is my last question for the day. A baby was born with neural tube defect. What could have been given to the mother to prevent this condition in the baby? So what can be given for prophylaxis of neural tube defects? Whether it is folic acid, iron, thiamine, riboflavin. I want an answer from each and every one of you. Come on. So now I'll meanwhile tell you that to prevent neural tube defects. Yes, I'm waiting for your answers. I'm looking at who all are answering as well. So to prevent neural tube defects, what is recommended is all women of childbearing age should be given what? Yes, folic acid in a dose of 400 microgram per day. So ideally this 400 microgram per day should be started at least 1 month before conception. 1 month before conception. So it's not like after pregnancy is diagnosed you start folic acid. That is wrong. You have to start it at least 1 month before conception. So before planning the pregnancy, you have to start it for it to be effective. So in all women, this dose is required, and the dose is also asked. Okay, but in high risk women who have a history of a previous child with neural tube disorder, the dose is 10 times. That is 4,000 microgram or 4 milligram. Okay, and remember, neural tube disorder has got what kind of inheritance pattern? It has got multifactorial inheritance. So that means genetics and environment, host factors, everything plays a role. So neural tube defects have got multifactorial inheritance, right? So very, very important to remember folic acid supplementation, 400 microgram per day for all women. High risk women, 4,000 microgram or 4 milligram. When should it be started? At least 1 month before conception. Okay, right? So with to prevent neural tube defect, we give folic acid during pregnancy to the mother, right? So these are some very, very important topics. So kudos to all of you for staying through the session and answering in such a nice manner, right? So I'm sure all of you are having a very good preparation and are doing multiple rounds of revision. So now with the little bit of time that is left, please try to do at least 2 or 3 times more revision of the source that you've studied from. For pediatrics, do watch this session once again and you'll get the PDF of the session also. Please watch the rapid revision videos for revision at least 2 to 3 times. So you'll get at least 15 to 20 questions you'll be able to answer use from the information in those rapid revision videos. Please go through the previous PYQs, okay, PYQ topics, though you know PYQ topics and sessions that we've taken. Some of them are freely available on YouTube also. Right, and very, very important is practice MCQs. So throughout the day, keep revising, make a schedule, keep revising, and whenever you're feeling tired, try to practice some MCQs. Or what you can do is another thing that you can do is in the morning when you're fresh, do time. You allot specific time for your MCQs, and say in 30 minutes you want to do 50 MCQs. So like that, you give a particular time for yourself, solve the questions, and make a habit of attempting each and every question. So some questions will be there, you know the answer, you mark it, but then also read the question properly, read each option before answering. Some questions you might have some doubt there, you try eliminating options. If you're able to eliminate 1 or 2 options, then you will be 50% having a chance of being correct. But because you have no negative marking, that is a trump card for your exam, so you must attempt each and every question, and you must go through the PYQ topics, the rapid revision videos, and I'm sure with this level of preparation that you already have, you are definitely going to crack it. So I'll be waiting for messages from each and every one of you after your exam is over, and I want all of you to be successful in the exam and see you on the other side preparing for your PG entrance exam. All the very best, friends. God bless you.